A federal judge just threw out Trump's revenge prosecutions against Letitia James and James Comey. And before anybody says, dismissed on a technicality, let me tell you what actually happened. Because this wasn't a technicality, this was justice. The prosecutor Trump installed to indict his political enemies was so unqualified, so unlawfully appointed, and so incompetent that she may have never legally charged Comey at all. The grand jury didn't even see the final indictment they were supposed to vote on. This is the story of a beauty pageant queen who became a federal prosecutor overnight, rushed 2 indictments in 5 days to beat a deadline, and proved exactly why constitutional safeguards exist. Let's break this down with what the judge actually found and why the Justice Department's threat to appeal should terrify every American. US District Judge Cameron Currie, a Clinton appointee, ruled that Lindsey Halligan's appointment as interim US attorney was unlawful, not improper, not questionable, unlawful. And here's the key quote from the ruling, and I quote from Judge Cameron Currie. All actions flowing from Ms. Halligan's defective appointment, including securing and signing Mr. Comey's indictment, were unlawful exercises of executive power, and are hereby set aside. Translation: everything that Halligan did as a prosecutor was void. The indictments, the grand jury presentations, all of it. But here's what makes this justice, not just a technicality. The judge didn't just find a paperwork error. She found that allowing this appointment to stand would mean, in her words, the government could send any private citizen off the street, attorney or not, into the grand jury room to secure an indictment as long as the Attorney General gives her approval after the fact. That cannot be the law. So think about that. What the Justice Department is arguing is they can install anyone, qualified or not, appointed properly or not, and just rubber stamp it afterwards. And the judge quite rightly said, no, that's not how constitutional government works. So who is Lindsey Halligan? She was the prosecutor that Trump installed. Her background: she was an insurance lawyer with no criminal law experience, 0 prosecutorial experience, never tried a criminal case. She'd never even tried one criminal case in her whole life. She was also one of Trump's personal lawyers and a former White House aide. And she'd been previously tasked with scrubbing facts from the Smithsonian Museum's exhibits. She went from defending Trump to prosecuting his enemies overnight. She replaced the replacement, Eric Siebert, a career federal prosecutor since 2010, Trump's own appointee on Inauguration Day. Siebert reviewed the evidence against Comey and James, and his entire office of experienced career prosecutors recommended against charging both targets. And on what basis? Insufficient evidence. So Trump forced Siebert out on September the 19th. On the very same day, Trump posted on Truth Social pressuring Attorney General Pam Bondi to speed up the prosecutions, claiming they were killing our reputation and credibility. The next day, on September the 20th, Halligan was announced as the replacement. So here's the legal problem. Here's why her appointment was unlawful. Federal law says interim U.S. attorneys can serve 120 days maximum without a Senate confirmation. After that, federal judges in that district court take over the appointment power, not the president and not the Attorney General. Why? To prevent exactly what Trump tried here, firing prosecutors who won't pursue political enemies and installing loyalists who will. Siebert's 120 days had already expired. Federal judges had already exercised their authority to extend his term. Once Siebert was gone, judges retained that appointment power, and not Bondi. But Bondi ignored the judges and installed Halligan anyway. And then the Justice Department described this as a paperwork error. Give me a break. And what did Judge Currie call it? She called it an unlawful exercise of executive power. The rushed prosecution, the desperate timeline. September 20th, Halligan is appointed. Then, on September the 25th, Halligan presents the Comey case to the grand jury. September 30th, the statute of limitation expires, 5 years from Comey's 2020 testimony. She had 5 days to indict Comey before the statute of limitations ran out, closing the window to prosecute him on that charge forever. And she was the sole prosecutor to present both cases. No team and no experienced career prosecutors assisting her. Just her. So, why this matters? Other prosecutors in her office recommended against prosecuting Comey and James. In fact, her entire office said so. Only someone unqualified and with unquestioning loyalty would ignore that recommendation and proceed anyway. And here's the kicker. And you remember how I said she might not even have legally charged Comey at all? Court proceedings revealed that Halligan, for unclear reasons, didn't present the final indictment used to charge Comey to the grand jury, meaning the jurors didn't actually review or vote on the final charges. Magistrate Judge William Fitzpatrick found a disturbing pattern of profound investigative missteps, including telling jurors Comey didn't have a Fifth Amendment right to not testify at the trial, which is completely wrong. And she didn't even present a complete transcript, which you've got to do. You have to present the whole thing to the jury. And then using an unrelated search warrant. Judge Fitzpatrick said the case showed an indictment first, investigate later approach. This wasn't just an unlawful appointment. This was an incompetent execution by someone who had no business being anywhere near a grand jury. The targets. Who was being prosecuted? James Comey, charged with false statements to Congress and obstruction. He was the former FBI director who appointed the special counsel who investigated the Trump-Russia contacts. And also, Comey publicly compared Trump to a mob boss. And Letitia James, she was charged with bank fraud and false statements. Letitia James was the New York Attorney General who successfully prosecuted Trump for an enormous amount of civil fraud, which I covered in great detail in previous videos. Over a 7 or 8 year period, it was something like $7 to $14 billion worth of fraud. Letitia James successfully prosecuted the Trump organization, including Trump, demonstrating fraud for an extended period of time. And the alleged crime for Letitia James? Standard mortgage paperwork. The prosecutors claim misclassified property. We've seen this before. And there's a pattern here. Let's look at Adam Schiff, who is currently the senator for California. Adam Schiff led both impeachment investigations against Donald Trump, who also publicly pressured for prosecution in the same Truth Social post. And Trump also pressured Pam Bondi to prosecute Adam Schiff and that same Truth Social post that I mentioned earlier. Every target had directly challenged Donald Trump's power. So this wasn't law enforcement. This was organized political retaliation. And the selective enforcements. Trump's civil fraud case documented on a per annum basis ranging between $812 million to $2.2 billion of fraud, overvaluations, inflating the value of assets over many years. 0 criminal charges. And what was Letitia James accused of? Allegedly misclassifying a mortgage property. And then this was all rushed through in 5 days by an unqualified prosecutor, rushing through to federal criminal indictments. When there are 0 consequences for multiple $1 billion of fraud, but opposing Trump triggers federal prosecutions, you're no longer dealing with a justice system. You're dealing with a protection racket. And then this process is a punishment. Just think about this. Even if the cases are dismissed, the damage is already done. This can happen to anyone. And in this case, James Comey and Letitia James had to pony up thousands of dollars in legal costs. Just think about the amount of money involved in defending a kind of case like this, even if it's on frivolous grounds, even if it's completely trumped up, a case on vapor. You still have to face the court. You still have to respond. You still have to show up in court, and you need legal representation. And that's not cheap. This is federal criminal prosecutions. These are serious prosecutions, but done based on frivolous evidence and incompetent execution. I mean, let's face it, and both Letitia James and James Comey had to spend months with this hanging over their heads. And who knows? Maybe they had to spend millions of dollars in defense. Hopefully they had defense funds, but still, can you imagine if you were indicted like this based on trumped up charges that were not real? This is a tactic of draining your opponents. It is the most improper use of the justice system. This isn't about justice. This is about political retribution and a vendetta against your political foes. Is this the kind of America that people want to be in? And experienced prosecutors have said that these were charges that had no basis, no reason to have ever been brought to trial. And here's the cruel genius of this strategy. Even when you win, you lose. James Comey and Letitia James won today. The charges were thrown out, but they're not getting those months back. They're not getting that money back, which I think they honestly should. For this kind of thing, you should be able to sue the government, in my view, especially in frivolous and politically charged improper use of the Justice Department. And they're not getting back all the stress they suffered, and they don't get back the damage to their reputations. And there's all sorts of political costs to this kind of federal indictment. And that's the point. The indictment itself becomes the weapon, and the legal fees become the punishment. And the public spectacle puts a chilling effect on the rest of the population. It becomes a deterrent. And it warns anybody else who might challenge Trump, this is what might happen to you. And as Comey said in his video response, this was a prosecution based on malevolence and incompetence. But here's the thing, the malevolence was achieved even in this complete clown show of a prosecution. And what's the upshot? You force your enemies to have to defend themselves. You force them to have to shell out significant amounts of money. And what's the tactic? Tie people up for months, having to defend themselves based on the most frivolous and ridiculous and threadbare cases. It makes people have to live under a cloud of uncertainty. And this is totally unfair. Now, if there was merit to charges, that's a totally different thing. There was no merit in this. And have a look at the series of experienced prosecutors who refused to be the prosecutors in this case. And what does that tell you? When a complete office of experienced federal prosecutors refused to engage on this, it tells you a lot about the case, doesn't it? It makes every other critic think twice about speaking and making criticisms. And if you lose, they can just appeal all the way up to the Supreme Court. And we all know what happens in the Supreme Court, how many biased rulings that are totally against the Constitution they've made. I mean, it's outrageous. I mean, I call this the Supreme Court ruling that the earth is flat. They can do basically that. They can make any ruling they like. Because who can overrule them? Oh, we're going to impeach them? How can you do that when the Republicans hold the executive, both the Senate and the House of Representatives and the Congress? How can you challenge even the most bizarre, ridiculous, insane ruling? Because the Supreme Court, there is no check on it to make bizarre rulings. This is a terrible flaw in the system. And then they can drag it out longer. They can keep people in this perpetual state of being drowned in criminal cases, draining their resources, draining their resolve, having this Damoclean sword over their heads. This is weaponizing the Department of Justice for personal and for political reasons. This is not about justice. This is about a strategy and a tactic of draining your opponents. And this is how authoritarianism works. This is authoritarian consolidation at work. Exhaust your enemies unfairly, unjustly. The courtroom then becomes the punishment for daring to support the democracy, for daring to support the Constitution, for daring to stand up for justice. This is the reward you get. And that's when they can't even prosecute properly and can't secure a conviction. This is still doing terrible damage. So what happens now? Can Letitia James and James Comey be recharged? The thing was, the cases were dismissed without prejudice. Technically means the charges can be refiled. However, for James Comey, because the statute of limitations ran out, Judge Currie ruled that the Department of Justice cannot refile. And she also ruled that they can't invoke a 6-month extension either. So That's it for Comey for this particular indictment, but not so for Letitia James. The dismissing of the case is not like double jeopardy. You see, for Letitia James, the accusations against her are still within the limits of the statute of limitations. So Letitia James remains vulnerable if the Department of Justice can get itself together and properly appoint a prosecutor, and provided they can execute the process to indict competently. So Letitia James doesn't get a double jeopardy because they never got to a trial. I think this is really unfair in many ways, that they can just repeat this, keep doing it. Just think about it. This is insane. This is the system of justice. The Trump regime can now lay charges against anybody in the country, put any old person in to do it in the most incompetent way, tie you up for months, drain you of your resources, and rinse and repeat. They can spin up as many as they like. There's nothing to stop them other than the judges throwing them out. But you are then in the firing line. This is true of anybody now. This is setting a precedent that the Justice Department has now become a weapon of war against your opponents. This is setting a precedent that any future presidents, if the democracy actually holds and a dictatorship or some sort of authoritarian regime doesn't succeed, which is what the current situation is, I would argue that we are in an authoritarian consolidation period. This can be used as a weapon against anybody. These cases never made it to the trial stage. So Letitia James is still open to being charged again by the Department of Justice if the Department of Justice wins on appeal or appoints a lawful prosecutor. The White House press secretary, Carolyn Leavitt, told Fox News the Department of Justice intends to appeal, saying, "We believe the attorney in this case, Lindsey Halligan, is not only extremely qualified for this position, but she was in fact legally appointed." This is the MAGA playbook. Completely turn the truth on its head. This is clear cut. This is public record. The court records clearly show what happened and why. This is chapter and verse documented. But the White House press secretary tells us that Lindsey Halligan, the pageant queen, was totally competent and did everything right and was completely qualified and appropriate, etc., and that it was all done perfectly right. And somehow they're going to tell us that, Judge Currie was an activist judge or something like that. See, any judge that actually follows the law, follows the Constitution, and applies it as it was intended, as it's been applied for hundreds of years, they are activist judges because they're not ruling the way that Donald Trump wants. That's what happens in an authoritarian regime. The will of the dictator determines what is justice and what is not, determines what is true and what is not. So if Donald Trump says, or any of his spokespeople say something, that automatically for MAGA becomes the truth. And just watch as that alternative fact is repeated with such volume by the right-wing machine through Fox News, through Newsmax, and through all of the right-wing commentators. You watch the talking points come out and you watch the zone be flooded that will make it out that James Comey was totally guilty and that he's got off with a major crime, which anybody looking at the facts can see it was a threadbare case, rushed and incompetently delivered by somebody who was totally unqualified and totally inexperienced, a rookie prosecutor who had no business being in the jury room for the grand jury and no business leading that case and wasn't even appointed correctly within rules that have been well established. That's what happened. And if anybody says, Letitia James, she's terrible, she's done all this fraud, rubbish, just have a look at it. This is trumped up nonsense. It's threadbare. Go have a look at it. Chapter and verse, same playbook that's been used before, this idea of mortgage fraud. And it's usually based on some minor ridiculous number like $75 or something. That's what the Schiff case was all over. And yet Donald Trump can do $7 to $14 billion worth of fraud and he gets nothing, no criminal case. And in the civil case, even though it was ruled that he had committed fraud, as had his organization, an appeal court took the $27 or $512 million fine and reduced that to zero. Now, that's justice, right? If you're MAGA, that's just. You can go out and do billions of dollars of fraud for even decades potentially, but for years, totally forensically and through accounting and through verification and through corroboration under oath, all documented and laid out, chapter and verse laid down, fully established even by the appeal court saying, yeah, the fraud was correct. He got nothing. But yet it's all right for him to drain his opponents for nothing, but make them out to be criminals. Just watch. I predict that the airwaves are going to be flooded for weeks with, oh, that criminal bad James Comey. Oh, that Letitia James, what a terrible person. She did this terrible, horrendous thing, and that she's guilty of the worst possible crimes and should be locked up. For what? For some paperwork error, if there is anything in there. Good luck with finding something. And often it's just focused on and trumped up and spun up to be something horrendous, like some basic process. And who doesn't make some errors in some of these things? We're talking about a minor error probably worth a few bucks compared to what? $7 to $14 billion, that kind of range. Just think about that. You compare that. It's like in the case for Adam Schiff, it amounted to something ridiculous, like $70 or something silly. And Attorney General Pam Bondi said the Justice Department will be taking all available legal action, including launching an immediate appeal. So the constitutional crisis, this is not isolated. And if you think that it's just limited to Lindsey Halligan, think again. There's a similar situation going on in New Jersey. Alina Habba, also a Trump personal lawyer with no experience being a prosecutor. Similar interim U.S. attorneys have been disqualified for violating the 120-day rule. And let's face it, federal judges across the country, including Trump appointees, are all reaching the same conclusion, that this type of appointment is in violation of the Constitution. It violates the checks on executive power. And here's an alarming thing to think about. If the Department of Justice appeals up to the Supreme Court, there's a 6-3 conservative majority. And if they take the side of the Department of Justice, no matter how fanciful or crazy that is, the consequences could be catastrophic. In theory, the Supreme Court could invalidate the 120-day rule, even if it's there in black and white. And then think about that. Presidents could, on a dime, fire any prosecutor that doesn't follow their exact orders. So the idea of justice and impartiality are thrown out the window, and prosecutors become partisan. They become MAGA prosecutors. And let's face it, the irony here is that MAGA was all about the deep state. Well, the deep state, in reality, I think, was just anybody that followed the Constitution and didn't bow down to Trump's crazy notion about where he wanted to go and wanted to have absolute power. But what's happened, though, is we now have a MAGA state, one where political appointees get to make the rules, where political appointees are going to have to follow whatever the whim is of whoever the president is. And what does that sound like? That sounds like an authoritarian regime where a dictator dictates who is prosecuted, who is guilty, and who they can pardon. So even the worst criminals, and let's face it, we've seen many people that had convictions pardoned by Trump 2.0. Reward your friends, punish your enemies. Is this the kind of America? Is this what we call justice now? Because that's what's happening. This would open the door to having unconfirmed loyalists being engaged indefinitely with no need for the Senate to approve them. No Senate oversight, no judicial review, no checks on the executive, and certainly no checks on revenge prosecutions. Here's what Judge Currie protected. The judge didn't just dismiss 2 cases. She protected the principle that the president cannot use the Justice Department to target political enemies. As James Comey said, a message has to be sent that the president cannot use the Department of Justice to target political enemies. I don't care what your politics are, you have to see that this is fundamentally un-American and a threat to the rule of law that keeps all of us free. So let's wrap this up. This wasn't a technicality. This was a federal judge enforcing constitutional limits on executive power. Limits specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of abuse. An unqualified loyalist was unlawfully installed to rush baseless indictments against political enemies. Halligan botched these prosecutions so badly that Comey may not have been legally indicted at all. The system held this time, but the Justice Department is appealing. And if the Supreme Court overrules these judges, every check on presidential revenge like this opens the door to political prosecutions. This will establish a precedent, having unfettered powers to prosecute political opponents, even with no real evidence. The question isn't whether Trump is going to come for his enemies in the future. The question is whether the courts will stop him next time.